This is absurd.
In a quiet suburban neighborhood, life seemed to move at a steady, predictable pace. The streets were lined with identical homes, each with freshly mowed lawns, trimmed hedges, and driveways that gleamed under the morning sun. To any outsider, it looked like the perfect place to raise a family. But beneath the surface, it was a neighborhood tightly controlled by its homeowners association, an organization notorious for its rigid rules and relentless enforcement. Among the homeowners was a woman named Claire, a schoolteacher who had recently decided to transform part of her front yard. She wasn't looking to stand out, nor was she trying to break the harmony of the neighborhood. She simply wanted to plant a small vegetable garden, tomatoes, peppers, and herbs, that would both cut down her grocery bills and bring a bit of freshness into her cooking. To Claire, it wasn't just about saving money. It was about self-sufficiency, sustainability, and a touch of joy that came from tending the earth. For weeks, she carefully cultivated her garden. Her neighbors often saw her in the early mornings, crouched by the soil with gloves on, watering the seedlings and checking their progress. The plants flourished quickly, soaking up the summer sun and growing into a lush display of greenery. Friends who stopped by praised her for the idea, and some even asked if she could share tips. To Claire, the garden was harmless, beautiful even, and certainly no more intrusive than the manicured flower beds that lined the street. But the HOA didn't see it that way. One morning, as Claire stepped outside with her watering can, she noticed an envelope taped to her front door. It was stamped with the HOA's logo in bold black letters. Inside was a notice, short and to the point. She had violated the community's aesthetic guidelines by planting vegetables in her front yard. The letter explained that her garden did not conform to the uniform appearance mandated by the HOA rules, which allowed only decorative plants and flowers in visible areas. At the bottom of the notice was a fine, $250, payable within 30 days. Claire was stunned. $250 for growing food on her own property? She reread the notice several times, convinced she had misunderstood. But the message was clear. If she didn't pay, further penalties would follow, and the HOA hinted at potential legal action if the violation was not corrected. The fine wasn't just an inconvenience, it was insulting. To Claire, her garden was not a violation but an expression of personal freedom. It wasn't harming anyone, nor was it an eyesore. The vegetables were neatly planted, the soil well maintained, and the entire setup blended seamlessly with her landscaping. Yet, here she was, being penalized for something she saw as entirely harmless. When she shared the news with her closest neighbors, reactions were mixed. Some sympathized with her frustration, agreeing that the HOA's rules were unreasonable and outdated. Others, however, warned her not to push back, reminding her of the HOA's power to escalate matters. It was well known that the association had a reputation for being ruthless, piling on fines and dragging homeowners into long, expensive disputes. Claire weighed her options. She could simply pay the fine, remove the garden, and avoid conflict. But that didn't sit right with her. Why should she be punished for something so trivial? Why should a group of board members dictate what she could or couldn't do on her own property, especially when her so-called violation was neither harmful nor disruptive? As the days passed, Claire noticed a shift in how some of the HOA board members behaved toward her. When she passed them on the street, they offered cold stares or muttered comments under their breath. It was clear they wanted her to comply without resistance, to quietly accept the punishment and move on. But the more pressure they applied, the more determined she became to fight back. Claire began researching HOA rules, looking into state laws, and seeking advice from others who had faced similar issues. What she found was both alarming and empowering. In many cases, HOAs had overstepped their boundaries, enforcing rules that clashed with local ordinances, or even state laws. Homeowners across the country had been fined for everything from leaving trash cans visible for too long to painting their front doors a slightly different shade of beige. But in some of those cases, homeowners had fought back, and won. The $250 fine became more than just a penalty. It became a symbol of something larger, a fight for fairness, a fight against unnecessary control, and a fight for the right to make reasonable choices about one's own home. Claire decided she wouldn't pay the fine. Instead, she drafted a letter to the HOA board, challenging their decision. She pointed out that her garden was well kept, did not harm the neighborhood's appearance, and fell within her rights as a homeowner. She requested that the fine be revoked and the rule reconsidered. The board responded quickly, but not in the way Claire had hoped. They doubled down, insisting that the rules were clear and non-negotiable. If she did not remove the garden and pay the fine, they warned, additional penalties would follow. Their response was curt, dismissive, and meant to intimidate. But the HOA didn't realize something important. Claire's fight was no longer private. Word of the dispute had started to spread through the neighborhood and, more importantly, beyond. Friends shared her story online, where it began to attract attention from people who had their own grievances with HOAs. The idea that someone could be fined for planting tomatoes in their yard struck a chord, and soon her story was gaining traction. And then, unexpectedly, it reached City Hall. The mayor, a longtime advocate for sustainability and community gardening, caught wind of what was happening in Claire's neighborhood. To him, this wasn't just a petty HOA dispute. It was a matter of principle. He believed residents had a right to grow their own food, especially when it posed no threat to anyone else. The moment the mayor became aware of the situation, the balance of power shifted. The HOA had picked a fight it wasn't prepared for, and the quiet streets of the neighborhood were about to become the stage for a much larger battle. And this battle was only just beginning. As the mayor's office first became aware of the controversy, the story was still spreading quietly across online forums and community pages. A simple post about an HOA fining a schoolteacher for growing tomatoes in her yard had struck a nerve, and commenters from across the city were expressing disbelief and outrage. What seemed like a small local dispute suddenly transformed into an example of everything people despised about unchecked HOA power. The mayor, a man known for his grassroots beginnings and strong ties to community projects, saw more than just a viral headline. He had spent years supporting sustainability initiatives, encouraging residents to grow food and reduce waste. To him, Claire's small vegetable patch represented something admirable, a citizen taking steps toward self-reliance and environmental responsibility. The idea that she had been punished for it by her own HOA did not sit well with him. Behind the polished walls of City Hall, discussions began. Advisors briefed the mayor on the situation, providing details of the HOA's regulations and how they conflicted with the city's own initiatives. There were programs already in place promoting community gardens, edible landscapes, and homeowner sustainability. Claire's garden wasn't just harmless. It aligned perfectly with the city's goals. The mayor saw an opportunity not only to right a wrong, but to send a message. Meanwhile, back in Claire's neighborhood, tensions grew thicker by the day. The HOA board, led by a president with a reputation for strict enforcement, was feeling the heat. They were used to quiet compliance, homeowners paying fines without protest, and disputes fading into silence. But Claire had broken the pattern. Her refusal to pay, her letter of defiance, and the growing attention on her case threatened the control they prided themselves on maintaining. The board held closed-door meetings, whispering about strategy. Their goal was simple: shut down the story before it grew any larger. They wanted Claire to cave, to admit defeat, and to restore their authority. But with each passing day, the situation slipped further out of their hands. Neighbors who once stayed silent began murmuring their support for Claire. The sight of her vegetable patch, lush, green, and thriving, became a quiet act of rebellion against rules that no longer felt fair. Claire, though nervous, drew strength from the support she received. She noticed neighbors dropping encouraging notes in her mailbox, small gestures that reminded her she wasn't alone. At the same time, though, she received subtle warnings from the HOA, reminders taped to her door, emails threatening escalation, and cold stares from certain board members whenever she left her house. It was intimidation, plain and simple, but Claire stood firm. Then came the unexpected twist. A letter from the mayor's office arrived in her mailbox. It was official, stamped with the city's seal, and it explained that her case had come to the mayor's attention. The letter expressed support for her situation and indicated that City Hall was reviewing the legality of the HOA's actions. For the first time since the ordeal began, Claire felt hope. The fight was no longer hers alone. The news of the mayor's involvement hit the HOA like a storm. Board members who once dismissed Claire as a nuisance now found themselves scrambling. If City Hall ruled against them, their reputation would be tarnished and their authority weakened. They knew that a public rebuke from the mayor could trigger wider investigations into their practices, something they desperately wanted to avoid. Behind the scenes, the HOA attempted damage control. They considered quietly waiving Claire's fine, hoping the issue would disappear. But it was too late. The story had already gained traction, and the mayor's office was committed to a public response. The HOA's efforts to contain the situation only revealed their growing desperation, and whispers of their panic spread quickly through the neighborhood. By this point, local media outlets had begun sniffing around. Reporters called Claire's home, seeking interviews. Camera crews drove through the neighborhood, capturing footage of the disputed vegetable patch. The quiet street, once unremarkable, was suddenly buzzing with attention. Some neighbors embraced the spotlight, while others feared the disruption. But all of them recognized one thing clearly: their HOA had lost control of the narrative. The mayor scheduled a press conference, and anticipation ran high. Residents across the city tuned in, eager to hear how he would address the issue. HOA members watched nervously, knowing the weight of his words could undo years of carefully maintained authority. When the mayor finally spoke, his message was firm. He praised homeowners who took initiative in sustainable living, criticized unnecessary restrictions on personal freedoms, and declared that no one should be punished for growing food on their property. Without naming Claire directly, he made it clear that her case had prompted his remarks, and that the city would be reviewing HOA policies to ensure they did not conflict with local values and laws. The statement reverberated like a shockwave. Residents across the city cheered the mayor's stance, while HOA boards elsewhere grew uneasy, wondering if their own strict rules might soon come under scrutiny. In Claire's neighborhood, the message was unmistakable. The HOA had gone too far, and now the highest levels of local government were watching. But the mayor's involvement didn't end there. His office reached out directly to the HOA board, demanding a full explanation of their actions. Records were requested, documentation reviewed, and suddenly the board found themselves under a microscope. What had begun as a simple fine had escalated into a political and public showdown, one they were wholly unprepared for. Claire watched it all unfold with a mixture of relief and disbelief. She had stood her ground, expecting little more than continued resistance, yet here she was, backed by the weight of City Hall. But she also knew the HOA wouldn't go down quietly. They had too much pride, too much invested in their authority, to simply admit fault and walk away. The lines were drawn more clearly than ever. On one side stood Claire, supported by her neighbors, the public, and now the mayor himself. On the other side, a rattled but determined HOA, desperate to preserve its power. The battle was no longer about a single vegetable garden. It was about control, freedom, and who ultimately held authority in the community. And though the mayor's involvement had shifted the balance, the fight was far from over. The HOA was already plotting its next move. The mayor's public statement had sent shockwaves through the community. Neighbors who once whispered cautiously now walked past Claire's yard with quiet pride, some even offering gestures of support in ways they hadn't dared before. The tomato vines and pepper plants stood taller than ever, not just as a garden, but as a symbol of defiance. The neighborhood was changing, but not everyone welcomed the shift. Inside the HOA's headquarters, a converted room in the president's own home, the atmosphere was tense. The board members gathered around a polished oak table, clutching binders of regulations and past violation records. They were shaken, but they were not ready to surrender. To them, the mayor's involvement wasn't just interference, it was humiliation. Their authority, built over years of strict enforcement, was now under threat. And they refused to let one woman and a few tomato plants unravel it all. The board began strategizing. They combed through every section of their covenant, searching for new ways to pressure Claire. If the fine over her vegetables was losing traction, perhaps they could find other violations to pin on her. They dispatched members to discreetly observe her property, snapping photos of anything they could twist into a breach of the rules. A slightly uneven fence post, a recycling bin left out a little too long, or even the shade of her mailbox. Nothing was too trivial to document. Soon, Claire received a series of new notices. Each one cited a different alleged violation, piling on more fines and threats of further action. To the HOA, it was a calculated move: overwhelm her with paperwork, drain her energy, and make her regret ever challenging them. They believed that if they buried her under enough pressure, she would eventually give in. But what the HOA hadn't anticipated was how their actions would look in the broader context. By now, Claire's story was widely known. Local reporters camped near her street, waiting for updates. Neighbors who once kept quiet now spoke openly to the press, describing years of frustration under the HOA's strict rule. The more the board tried to bury Claire, the more they exposed themselves. Claire, though rattled, found herself less isolated than before. Messages of encouragement flooded her from beyond her neighborhood. Strangers reached out, sharing their own HOA horror stories and thanking her for standing up. The fines that once felt crushing now looked like evidence, proof that the HOA was engaged in harassment rather than legitimate governance. The mayor's office also took notice. Staffers monitoring the situation recognized the pattern of retaliation and flagged it for review. If the HOA thought they could regain control through intimidation, they had miscalculated badly. The city was watching closely now, and every new notice they issued against Claire only added to the pile of evidence against them. Still, the HOA was stubborn. At their meetings, they reassured each other that this was simply a storm to be weathered. They spoke with arrogance, insisting that, no matter what the mayor said, HOA covenants were private contracts that gave them ultimate authority. In their minds, City Hall might posture, but it couldn't interfere in what they considered their domain. Yet cracks began to form within the board itself. Some members, sensing the growing public backlash, grew uneasy. They worried about their personal reputations, about being remembered not as protectors of the community, but as villains who punished a woman for growing food. Whispers of dissent spread through the group, but the president silenced them with fiery insistence that they must hold the line. To back down, he argued, would invite chaos. Meanwhile, Claire's garden continued to thrive. Each day, she tended it under the watchful eyes of both her neighbors and the cameras that occasionally appeared. What had started as a personal project had grown into a public symbol of resistance. Her tomatoes ripened into bright clusters, her herbs spread fragrant. Leaves and her peppers glowed in the sun. It was as if the plants themselves understood the weight of the battle being fought around them. The media began framing the story as more than a dispute over vegetables. It became a question of freedom versus control, individuality versus conformity. Editorials appeared in local papers, praising Claire and criticizing the HOA. Radio hosts discussed it with outrage, while callers flooded lines with their own tales of HOA overreach. The story had become a movement, and the HOA's every move only fueled the fire. But the board wasn't ready to relent. In a bold escalation, they began discussing the possibility of legal action. If Claire continued to resist, they considered filing suit against her, claiming breach of contract and violation of the covenant she had signed when purchasing her home. To them, this was the ultimate weapon, an expensive, drawn-out legal process designed to break her resolve. Word of this plan leaked quickly. Neighbors whispered about it, reporters caught wind of it, and soon it was once again on the mayor's desk. To the public, the idea that the HOA would drag a homeowner to court over a vegetable patch seemed absurd, even outrageous. And for the mayor, it was confirmation that intervention was no longer optional. The HOA had crossed a line, and stronger measures would be necessary to rein them in. Claire braced herself for the storm ahead. The possibility of a lawsuit loomed over her, but so did the growing wave of public support. For every threat the HOA issued, she received 10 messages of encouragement. For every notice taped to her door, another article appeared in her defense. The HOA believed they could isolate her, but instead, they had made her the center of a movement they could no longer control. Their counterattack had backfired spectacularly, and now, City Hall was preparing to push back harder than ever. The battle lines were drawn more sharply than before. Claire's garden stood as defiance in green and red, while the HOA doubled down with threats and intimidation. But now, with the mayor watching closely and the public firmly on her side, the HOA's once iron grip on the neighborhood was beginning to crumble. The next step would come not from Claire, but from City Hall itself. The HOA had played its hand, unleashing a wave of retaliatory fines and hinting at the threat of a costly lawsuit. But in their attempt to assert dominance, they had underestimated just how closely the eyes of the city were now fixed upon them. What had once been a neighborhood skirmish had transformed into a full-scale political battle, and the mayor was ready to escalate his involvement. Behind the walls of City Hall, the mayor's team began compiling a detailed report on the HOA. They collected copies of violation notices, interviewed residents who had long suffered under the board's heavy-handed tactics, and pulled records of past disputes. What emerged was a troubling pattern. The board had repeatedly used its power not to foster community harmony, but to control, intimidate, and profit. Homeowners had been fined for trivial infractions, threatened with liens, and in some cases coerced into costly settlements. The mayor recognized that Claire's garden dispute was not an isolated incident. It was the tip of a much larger iceberg, an opportunity to expose systemic abuse and send a message to HOAs citywide. Armed with mounting evidence, he directed his staff to prepare for formal action. This was no longer just about overturning a single fine. It was about accountability. In Claire's neighborhood, the pressure only grew. Reporters continued to appear, documenting the tension. Some residents were emboldened, openly voicing their frustration with the board, while others still feared retaliation. The HOA, sensing its authority slipping, doubled down on its rhetoric. They insisted they were simply upholding the rules, that the covenant was sacrosanct, and that those who defied them risked unraveling the entire community. But their words rang hollow. The mayor's office soon released a statement that struck like a hammer. The city had launched a formal investigation into the HOA's practices. A hotline was opened for residents to share their stories anonymously, and within hours, dozens of complaints poured in. Tales of unjust fines, selective enforcement, and bullying tactics painted a damning picture of the board's operations. The HOA tried desperately to dismiss the complaints as exaggerations, but the evidence was piling up faster than they could contain it. Their carefully crafted image of order and responsibility was unraveling in the public eye, replaced by the perception of an overreaching, self-serving clique. Meanwhile, Claire found herself at the center of a storm she hadn't anticipated. Her simple refusal to pay a $250 fine had ignited something far larger. Neighbors who once kept their heads down now approached her to share their gratitude. Strangers sent letters of support. Advocacy groups for homeowners reached out, offering legal guidance and public backing. Claire's garden was no longer just hers. It had become a rallying point for reform. But the HOA president, a man who prided himself on never losing a fight, refused to accept defeat. He organized emergency meetings, urging his board to stand united. He railed against the mayor's interference, portraying it as government overreach into private contracts. To him, this was not about vegetables or fairness, it was about power. And he was determined to hold on to it. Yet even within the board, cracks deepened. Some members, nervous about the mounting scrutiny, quietly questioned whether continuing the fight was wise. They worried about legal consequences, about the personal fallout of being tied to an organization under investigation. The president dismissed their concerns, but the unease was spreading. The mayor, sensing the HOA's weakening grip, decided to increase the pressure further. He announced a town hall meeting, inviting residents from across the city to voice their experiences with HOAs. The event drew a massive crowd, with Claire sitting quietly near the front. One by one, homeowners shared stories eerily similar to hers. Fines for trivial matters, threats of foreclosure, and boards that acted more like tyrants than community stewards. The town hall was covered extensively by local media. Footage of emotional testimonies aired on nightly news broadcasts, and clips went viral online. The narrative had shifted decisively. HOAs were no longer seen as protectors of neighborhood order, but as unchecked enforcers of arbitrary rules. And at the center of this transformation stood the story of Claire and her vegetable garden. Back in her neighborhood, the atmosphere was changing rapidly. Those who once feared the HOA's retaliation began to push back. More residents questioned their own fines, challenged the board's decisions, and demanded transparency. For the first time in years, the board's power was being openly contested, and the president's grip on the community began to falter. The mayor's investigation soon uncovered more troubling details. Financial records revealed questionable spending by the board, with funds allocated for administrative costs that lacked proper documentation. Rumors of favoritism and backroom deals, long whispered among residents, suddenly had credibility. The board was not just guilty of overreach, it was potentially guilty of corruption. With this revelation, the HOA found itself cornered. Public support had turned decisively against them. City Hall was circling, and even within their own ranks, loyalty was cracking. The president's once unshakable authority was eroding, and the board's every move only seemed to tighten the noose. Claire, though still wary of the storm around her, felt a quiet sense of vindication. She hadn't sought this battle, but she had stood her ground, and in doing so, had exposed something far larger than she ever imagined. Her garden, once deemed a violation, had become the catalyst for change. But the HOA wasn't finished yet. Desperate and cornered, they began plotting a final move, a last attempt to reassert control and salvage their reputation. It was risky, reckless even, but in their minds, it was the only way to avoid total collapse. The pressure on the HOA had reached a boiling point. With the mayor's investigation in full swing, residents turning against them, and the media spotlight exposing their every misstep, the board found itself trapped in a corner. For years, they had thrived on silence, ruling their neighborhood through intimidation and compliance. But now, their methods were under scrutiny, and their power was slipping away with each passing day. The president of the HOA, who had once carried himself with unshakable confidence, was now consumed by desperation. He refused to accept that the garden dispute had spiraled beyond his control. To him, backing down was unthinkable. Admitting defeat to Claire, to the mayor, and to the public would mean the destruction of everything he had built his authority upon. If he surrendered now, the entire board would collapse, and with it, his carefully cultivated image of dominance. So he devised a plan. The strategy was bold, reckless, and rooted in arrogance. If Claire was the face of their downfall, then discrediting her would be their salvation. The president convinced the board that the only way to regain control was to paint Claire not as a victim, but as a rule breaker who endangered the integrity of the community. They gathered every notice, every photograph, every minor infraction they could scrape together, and prepared to use them not just in threats, but in a very public campaign against her. The board drafted a lengthy newsletter, distributed to every homeowner in the community. In it, they portrayed themselves as defenders of order, guardians of property values, and protectors of the covenant. They accused Claire of repeatedly flouting rules, claiming her vegetable garden was just one of many violations. They suggested that her defiance threatened the harmony of the neighborhood and that the mayor's involvement was nothing more than political theater. It was a calculated attempt to shift the narrative, to pit neighbor against neighbor, and to fracture the fragile unity that had begun forming around Claire's cause. But the effort backfired almost immediately. Residents, already embittered by years of heavy-handed enforcement, saw the newsletter for what it was: a smear campaign. Instead of turning against Claire, they rallied around her with renewed determination. Local reporters got their hands on the newsletter, and within days, the story exploded again. Headlines denounced the HOA's tactics, framing them as bullies, lashing out in desperation. The board's attempt to discredit Claire only deepened their own downfall, but the president was not finished. Enraged by the backlash, he pushed the board toward their most dangerous move yet: formal legal action. He insisted that if they could not win in the court of public opinion, they would win in a court of law. Filing a lawsuit against Claire, he argued, would remind everyone that HOA contracts were binding and that the board still held real power. The idea sent ripples of fear through the community. Residents whispered about the costs, the spectacle, and the possibility of Claire being dragged through a lengthy legal battle. For the board, it was a high-stakes gamble. If they won, they could salvage their reputation and re-establish dominance. But if they lost, it would not only destroy the HOA's authority, but also expose them to even greater scrutiny. Claire, though shaken by the news, did not falter. She had come too far to back down, and now she had allies who refused to let her face the fight alone. Advocacy groups reached out, offering legal assistance. The mayor's office, already deeply invested in the case, made it clear they would not stand idly by. What the HOA had envisioned as a show of strength was quickly transforming into yet another stage for their undoing. As the legal filings became public, more damning information about the HOA began to surface. Leaked documents revealed questionable spending practices and unexplained financial transfers from the association's accounts. What was supposed to be an offensive move against Claire now became a weapon in the hands of investigators. Every piece of paper the HOA submitted became another thread unraveling their secrets. Inside the board, tensions reached their peak. Members who had once stood firmly behind the president now questioned his judgment. Some feared personal liability. Others worried about the legal and financial ruin that loomed ahead. But the president, blinded by pride, pressed on, determined to see his plan through no matter the cost. Meanwhile, the garden at the center of it all continued to grow, as if mocking the chaos swirling around it. The tomatoes ripened into deep shades of red, the peppers dangled in clusters, and the herbs filled the air with their fragrance. Neighbors often lingered near the yard, admiring it not just for its beauty, but for what it represented: resilience against tyranny. The lawsuit became the final straw for many. At City Hall, the mayor's team prepared a decisive response. No longer was this a matter of investigation alone. The HOA's conduct had escalated to a point where intervention was not just political, but necessary. The city attorney's office began drafting motions, and discussions of stripping the HOA of certain powers entered the public conversation. The president had wanted to make an example out of Claire. Instead, he had made an example of himself. His desperate attempts to cling to control only revealed his abuses more clearly, and each move he made only deepened the hole he was digging for the board. The neighborhood, once fractured by fear, now stood at the brink of change. What had started as a quiet street dispute over a garden was transforming into a defining moment for the entire community. The HOA had placed all their bets on a desperate gamble, and now the outcome would determine not just Claire's future, but the future of the board itself. The stage was set for the final confrontation, one that would either dismantle the HOA's authority or leave the community forever scarred by their rule. The HOA's lawsuit was supposed to be their masterstroke, the final move that would restore their control and silence their critics. But instead, it became the undoing of everything they had built. What they had envisioned as a show of strength turned into a public spectacle of arrogance and corruption, unraveling piece by piece under the scrutiny of City Hall, the press, and even their own neighbors. As the legal filings entered the public record, reporters pored over every document. The board had intended to portray Claire as a reckless rule-breaker, but what the papers revealed was far more damaging for the HOA itself. Their own filings exposed inconsistencies, vague language in their covenants, and fines that far exceeded what state law allowed. What should have been their strongest weapon became an open window into years of abuse and mismanagement. The mayor's office seized the opportunity. The city attorney filed motions challenging the legitimacy of the HOA's lawsuit, pointing out not only the weakness of their case but also the troubling financial patterns uncovered during the investigation. At the same time, the hotline for complaints continued to receive calls, with more residents stepping forward to share their own stories of harassment and intimidation. The pattern was undeniable, and the weight of public opinion pressed down, harder than ever. In Claire's neighborhood, the tension broke like a storm. For years, residents had whispered their frustrations in private, fearful of retaliation. But now, emboldened by the mayor's support and the HOA's unraveling, they began speaking out openly. At community gatherings, homeowners confronted the board directly, demanding answers about where their dues had gone and why fines were being issued for petty reasons. What once would have been unthinkable, challenging the board's authority, became the new normal. The president of the HOA, once so confident in his control, now found himself isolated. The same board members who had stood beside him began distancing themselves, unwilling to share in his downfall. Some resigned outright, citing exhaustion or personal reasons, though everyone knew the truth. They no longer believed the president could save them. His desperate gamble had failed, and now even his allies were abandoning ship. The garden that had sparked it all continued to thrive, a living reminder of the absurdity of the conflict. The tomatoes were harvested, plump and red, shared among neighbors who once might have feared even being seen near Claire's property. The peppers and herbs were passed around in small baskets, symbols of solidarity that grew stronger with every exchange. The board's attempts to frame the garden as a nuisance had backfired spectacularly. It had become the very heart of the community. When the lawsuit finally made it to court, the HOA's case collapsed almost immediately. The judge, unimpressed by the flimsy evidence and unconvinced by the exaggerated claims, dismissed the lawsuit outright. More importantly, the court documents had already sparked something larger, an inquiry into the board's finances. The whispers of corruption now had teeth, and the investigation shifted from City Hall to the state level. What began as a $250 fine had now triggered a potential audit that could dismantle the board's operations entirely. The president, faced with mounting pressure, attempted one last desperate maneuver. He called for an emergency meeting, urging the remaining members and homeowners to rally behind him, insisting that the HOA was under attack and that only unity could save it. But the turnout told the real story. Instead of applause and agreement, he was met with pointed questions, accusations, and outright anger. The very people he claimed to represent no longer trusted him, and the meeting ended not with support, but with a vote. The community, for the first time in years, chose to remove him as president. His reign, built on intimidation and fear, ended, not with victory, but with humiliation. He left the meeting in silence, his power stripped, his reputation destroyed, and his influence gone. In the weeks that followed, the HOA underwent sweeping changes. New members were elected to the board, people who had long dreamed of creating a more transparent and fair system. Rules were revised, fines reviewed, and residents finally given a voice in how their community was run. The oppressive atmosphere, that had once defined the neighborhood began to lift, replaced by a sense of optimism and cooperation. Claire, who had never sought the spotlight, found herself at the center of a movement that went far beyond her own garden. She continued to teach at the local school, tend to her plants, and live quietly, but her story became one told across the city and beyond. To many, she was proof that standing up, even against powerful opposition, could bring real change. The Mayor, too, used the outcome to push forward broader reforms. He introduced legislation that limited the authority of HOAs, ensuring that no homeowner would be fined for something as harmless as growing vegetables on their property. Across the city, other boards took notice, adjusting their own practices, in fear of facing the same fate. The ripple effects of Claire's fight spread further than anyone had expected, reshaping the balance of power between homeowners and their associations. And so, what began as a $250 fine ended as something far greater. It became the story of a community reclaiming its voice, a city standing up for its residents, and a simple garden that grew into a symbol of resilience. The HOA had tried to crush Claire with intimidation, but in the end, it was their own arrogance that destroyed them. The president who once ruled with fear was gone, the board had been reformed, and the neighborhood finally belonged to the people who lived there, not the ones who tried to control it. The tomatoes had won.